In continuing with the elements of drawing, we began with the tetractys, which was starting with a mark. Then we moved on to line and then shape, and our ultimate goal was to create form. You can create form using line to work with inside of a shape, and you can still create an illusion that something is three-dimensional. But the ultimate goal is to get to a place where, if given enough time, you can start with the elements of shading. Shading in general, the basic concept and principle of shading, I believe, is relatively simple. However, the execution can take many, many years, possibly decades, to master, to perfect your craft. Ultimately, what in my experience, is if you can shade any combination or variation of these basic shapes that we have here, you can shade anything. So we have the circle, which we will shade here in a minute to become a sphere. We have the cylinder, we have the egg-shaped oval, we have a cube, we have a cone, and we have a tetrahedron or a pyramid. And in shading these objects, if you can do this, you can do anything. As you see, the egg-shaped oval could be very similar to doing a portrait. A lot of these others, the cylinder could be just like shading an arm, a leg. A lot of these other objects could be still life objects. They could be things you see in nature. They could be trees, landscapes, all sorts of different forms. So ultimately, if you can shade any combination or variation of these basic shapes, you can shade anything. The main elements that are significant, and there aren't many. Some people will say, oh, when I do my shading, I have 100 values and so forth. Ultimately, the only elements that you really need to know and have a complete and full understanding of is, if we were shading the sphere, and we'll go into more distinctly into detail with this in a few minutes. But basically, all you need to know is you got to have, in the end product, you need to have a highlight, you need to have a light, you need to have halftone, you need to have a core shadow, and reflected light. And depending on where the object is placed, you would have a cast shadow. For me, I feel it's really important to avoid what is known as rim lighting, which is light that maybe if a surface is backlit, you would have light, the appearance that light would be on the edge of the form. I think, artistically speaking, that's something that should be avoided at all cost. I find it to be unartistic, and in the end, it destroys form. You want to have your light and your highlights and all aspects of form happen within your object. Therefore, when you use rim lighting, it destroys all that and takes away the three-dimensional quality and just begins to look like an outline. So, having said that, we'll now begin. Okay, we're going to begin with, first we'll begin with the sphere. And we'll go over each one of these elements. So we'll talk about the situation of adding the highlight, the light, halftone, core shadow, reflected light, and cast shadow. And how we make the sphere look as three-dimensional as possible. To begin with, we're going to start off, I will just very lightly add a tone. And I guess one thing I should just go over real quickly here before I begin. So I'm using Prismacolor pencils. These are the Verithin pencils. And if you notice, I have a very sharp point. It's really important when you're drawing to make sure that you keep your pencils very sharp. They can dull fairly quickly. So what I do is I have a whole handful of pencils here. They're all sharpened so that when I'm in my process, I don't have to stop. I can just sit down a pencil and grab another pencil and continue on. I find that much easier to draw. And I also use this Tombow Mono Zero eraser. If I make a tiny little mistake, I need to fix some small little area, this is just as important as the pencil. So I highly recommend these. So make sure your pencil has a very sharp point. You can get a very fine detailed line when using the point. And then for shading purposes, I like to turn it on its side, and it covers a great deal of territory very quickly. So you can shade a little bit faster. So to begin with here, we're getting back to the sphere or the circle. I am going to quickly place, I'll have, assuming my light source is coming from here, in nature, light tends to always come from above. The sun is above us and radiates light, so more often than not, your light source will always come from above, unless of course maybe you're sitting around a campfire or something of that nature where you're creating an artificial light source. Then the light source could be different. But generally speaking, in nature, light tends to come from above. So for the purposes of this today, I'm going to have my light source coming from above and from this angle on all of these. So if the light is coming from above here, everything that falls away from that light source will fall into shadow. So I'm going to very quickly put just a light tone on this half of the sphere. And this right now, and I've seen many examples over the years where this is how they teach you how to shade a sphere. So you have light coming from above and everything opposite falls into shadow. However, ultimately this is still flat in my opinion, because if you were to cover the top or the bottom half here and just to view the top, what you see here is still a flat shape. If we were to cover the top so that you just see the bottom, it still is a flat shape. It just has a tone over it. So it isn't technically very three-dimensional. Now what I want to do is I'm going to place a tone all the way around the edges, because I want the light, as we talked about before, we want to avoid rim lighting, and we want the light to happen with inside the form. So now I'm covering all of this area with halftone. So now what we see, if we are looking at this area is light. So we have one of the elements of shading is now in here, and we have halftone covering all of this. So we now have two elements included in the shading process. What we need to now add is a core shadow, something that distinguishes it. A lot of people make their darkest dark all the way down here on the bottom. That would be incorrect. The core shadow needs to run through here. So in this area, we want our darkest dark. So now I'm going to make this darker. And I still want it to be carefully blended. I don't just want to have a dark cut. You have to use it, make sure that it's blended. And if you notice, I'm doing my shading very controlled, and it, depending on how hard or how light I push my pencil down, does the shading for me. I'm not smearing it, I'm not using a blending stick. I'm just very carefully controlling what I do. So now we have in here, we have now added a core shadow. And ultimately, if we were to add a cast shadow in the end, the core shadow and the cast shadow need to be the same tone. We'll get to that a little bit later. But now, if we look at the elements that we have here, we have light. Light is in here. This whole area is light. We have halftone now covering all of this in this area right before the core shadow. We now have core shadow. And what we've now created is reflected light. Light coming up from the surface and lighting the bottom of the sphere. That is what makes it go round. If I had the core shadow all the way down here on the bottom and made this very dark, it would not have create the illusion that it's round. We want to create that illusion. Reflected light is very important. The great masters in the past, their ability to shade and their understanding of reflected light is unsurpassed. If you get really, really good at shading and you're looking at artwork that is excellent and looks very sculptural and three-dimensional, that artist probably had an exceptional understanding of reflected light. So what we have here is we want to draw all our viewers' attention into this area, but we still have a problem here. What we have is we have light, we have core shadow, we have our light, halftone, core shadow. We now have reflected light, but there's a problem with this because the reflected light and the halftone are still of the same value. So if you spend a little bit of time looking at this, you'll notice your eye is not necessarily drawn to this area. It's going to be fighting back and forth between the two because the core shadow needs to be blended more into the reflected light to go round, and we don't want to have our eye pulled away into the reflected light. So now I'm going to blend this a little more carefully, and I want to make the value of the reflected light just a little bit darker. And so let's blend this a little bit more. And I'm pushing a tiny bit harder now into the core shadow area. And I'm being very careful. And I'm also wrapping around in the shape of the sphere. So now our eye should be going up more toward the area of the light. And it should start to look more and more three-dimensional. If you remember, very much like when you look at these other shapes that we have here, they seem relatively flat and soft. And by the end of this, most of the line should disappear, and we should be mostly aware of just of the form and the object. And it's softly blended. Just takes a little bit of patience. So now you can see in here we have light, we have the halftone, we have the core shadow, and we now have reflected light. If we're going to add the cast shadow, and we want to make sure the darkest point is where the object touches the surface, and because this object is circular, we want to make sure that this is an ellipse, a circular form. And it will continue on a little bit onto the other side. Remember, this extends out this way. It also comes towards us and goes away. So the shadow is not just a straight line coming out. It has to be an elliptical shape. As the cast shadow moves away from the form, it gets lighter and softer. As it gets closer to the form, it gets darker. So right where it touches the surface will be the darkest point. And we want to make sure that the cast shadow, the darkest point in the cast shadow, is of the same value as the darkest point in the core shadow. If you make this super dark and then make this light, it's not going to work. If you make this too light and then the cast shadow too dark, it's not going to look correct. So make sure that those values are very similar. And this is something that, you can practice over and over again. I do this all the time. I do tons of spheres and cylinders, all sorts of unusual shapes. I stack shapes near each other. It's very fun to practice shading, and it's something you can do anywhere at any time. So now this should be looking pretty simple, very smooth, very round, and lots of subtlety. If you notice, all lines have disappeared. You're not seeing lines everywhere and so forth. It's all very carefully blended. And that's your ultimate goal, is to be aware of the shape and not so much aware of the drawing procedure at this point. So now the only thing that's missing is the highlight. So if the light's coming from this surface, I'm going to use my white pencil here. I have a nice soft white pencil, so I'm going to have the highlight. The lightest point, the brightest point is going to be right here. And then I'm going to soften just a little bit around that. Now, adding highlights is a really important thing to be careful of. A lot of people would make this whole area white. If you were to make this whole area white, it would make this become a flat tabletop-like surface. Remember, this is a rounded shape. It'll be different shading the cube and the pyramid, but when we have a sphere, because it's a rounded shape, everything needs to be subtle and smooth, and it has to blend carefully. So I'm just gonna, right in here is the brightest point, and then we soften that just around the edge. And then, so now we have a highlight. We have the highlight, we have light, we have halftone, we have core shadow, we have reflected light, and we have cast shadow. The cast shadow has a dark core area that blends away and gets softer as it moves away. So this is the basic principle of how you would shade a sphere. And let me just clean this up a tiny bit here. Because we're trying to have this represent more of the form, and we don't necessarily want to pay so much attention here to the line. So as best as possible, we're trying to eliminate the line that we began with. Obviously, we want to define the area, but hopefully just be aware of the principles of shading. So that is right here, that is the basis for shading the sphere. Next, I'm going to drop down to this area right here, and we're going to do the egg-shaped oval. The egg-shaped oval is very similar to the sphere, and that it is kind of rounded and soft. It doesn't have any sharp edges. So again, light coming from above here, everything on this side I'm going to put into shadow, and everything that goes under is going to fall in shadow. The light, the highlight's going to be somewhere in this area, so I'm just going to quickly put halftone over all of this. And then I will start to enhance the core shadow through here. And I want to build toward the light and ultimately where my highlight's going to go. Again, now as I add this core shadow through here, you can see, so now we are beginning to have light. We're beginning to have, let me just soften this a little more here. Now we have halftone. We have core shadow. And then right through here underneath, we have reflected light. But again, the reflected light needs to be, it's too similar in value to the halftone. The reflected light needs to be a little bit darker so that it goes under. So I'm gradually going to soften this through here and try to blend it into the line that I used to create the egg-shaped oval. I want to darken here the core shadow. And the principle behind shading the egg-shaped oval is very similar to how you would shade the rib cage, how you would shade the head in portraits, except there would be more information and more anatomical structure included that you would have to consider. So now here, continue to blend this. And soften the edges. And I'm going back between using the point of my pencil and the side of my pencil. Now we're going to add the highlight. So the highlight would be right in here. Remember, light's coming from above here, so we have our highlight. And we soften right around the highlight, so it's kind of subtle. And it gets the brightest points in here, and it gets softer as it moves away. And that is how we would shade the egg-shaped oval. And if I had more time, I'd be a little more subtle with this. I'm trying to do this maybe a little quicker than I would be doing my personal work. All right. So next, we'll do this cube. So the cube has slightly different principles than the sphere. Let's soften that. I missed a spot there. When you have sharp edges, the darkest dark will fall next to the lightest light. So if light's coming from above here, this side, this shape in here would be the opposite side of light, and your darkest dark would fall right in here, and your darkest dark will fall next to the lightest light. So just very quickly, I want to get this in here. So we're going to work from dark to light. So I want the darkest dark right in here. And then as we move away, all of this ultimately is going to fall in shadow because it's absent of light. But it will still have reflected light from anything reflecting from another surface off to the side. And as it moves away from the lightest light, as it recedes, it lightens. So right in here, we got our darkest dark. And this is our core shadow. So now we have light hitting the top. We have the core shadow, the darkest dark through here. We have the reflected light coming down the side plane. And this dark can extend down a little further. And the plane that's directly facing us also will begin with a dark at the top. So we're going to work from the darkest dark on this side down to the lights, and I'm going across the plane in my shading. All of this is going to fall into shadow. So let me get a tone on all of this. So this is our half tone. And although it may not quite be as dark as this side, it's still going to be fairly dark. So let me just, so that we distinctly have a side plane and a top surface. Let me darken that. And as we're going through this process, you can see how it's starting to become more three-dimensional. And I'll cross-hatch, but as if you notice, I'm cross-hatching very carefully so as to not have the viewer be aware of seeing all the individual lines. I'm blending this carefully. Now I want my shadow to come down a little further here. And I definitely want to distinguish the difference between the top plane and the side plane. This side plane here, I want darker. So I'm going to go back in here and just darken this a little more, trying to work from dark to light. And then the top plane, as it recedes into the distance, this needs to have a soft tone. Remember, the lightest light is near the darkest dark when you're dealing with a surface that is a sharp edge. This is not a rounded surface like the sphere, the egg-shaped oval. This is a sharp edge, very much like a tabletop or an object on a table. And then our highlight in here, the lightest light would be right in here, getting softer as it moves away. The lightest light is near the darkest dark when you're dealing with a sharp edge. And it does it subtly. And then, just like when we were shading the sphere up here, the cast shadow, if light's coming from here, the darkest dark is right near the edge, and it gets softer as we move away. So I'm going to have cast shadow in here. A little bit would go beyond. And we'll just do this real subtle here for purposes, but darkest dark. So the cast shadow in here should be the same value as the darkest dark up in here. And then softly it would move away. Okay, so that is that example of a sharp edge, and we'll skip over here to the pyramid because the pyramid's going to have similar concepts, except the light's going to slightly hit differently. So the darkest dark on the pyramid, if light's coming from this side, the darkest dark is going to run through here, but as it moves to the top, say this was a tall building of some sort, it would become lighter as it moves up. So the darkest dark is actually down lower in here, even though all of this side's going to fall into shadow. So we'll quickly put a halftone over all of this, just so you can see it. And now the darkest dark is going to fall in here next to the lightest light. So the darkest dark is going to be down near the bottom because light's coming from above, so we want it to recede, and as it moves toward the light, we'll have a softness. And reflected light through here, and I'm being careful to shade this across the form. And a little tone in here. Now, it's important to note that, let me just get this core shadow just a little darker. So now we have core shadow and we have reflected light. Now we're going to put a halftone here on this side, so it's going to be pretty soft. A little bit of soft tone near here in near the base. And then we have light. Just clean this line a little sharper. This is where the eraser comes in handy for that. And now our lightest light is going to be near the darkest dark, so it's going to be right through here. And it's going to get softer as it moves away. And it will continue on up a little ways, but the lightest light is next to the darkest dark. So we can enhance this darker through here a little bit more. And we want our reflected light to not be the same value as the halftone. So we have to make sure it's a little darker than our halftone because we want the attention drawn into this area. So now we'll carefully blend this in here. And I'm actually going to lighten this just a little in here along that edge. Just soften it just slightly. And then same as with the cube and in here with the sphere, cast shadow, our darkest dark in the cast shadow should be the same value as the darkest dark in the core shadow. So just very lightly put this so it's sitting on a surface. You always want to try to have this sitting on a surface unless you're trying to do maybe a floating sphere, which we're going to do another demonstration included with this with floating spheres. And this would head off in the general shape. Just clean this up so it's a little darker moving up. Core shadow needs to be a little darker and then carefully blended. And this is all, remember, it's all controlled by how heavy or how light I push the pencil to the paper. And so now we have the pyramid or tetrahedron. We've done the cube, we've done the egg-shaped oval, and the sphere. So now we'll go up here to the cylinder. So the cylinder, I've chosen to do this so that it has somewhat a little bit of foreshortening, a little bit of perspective. And remember, this is wrapping around this way. It's coming toward us. So if the light's coming from above, then everything that the core shadow is going to run through here, right through here. And we want to shade along that edge. We're going this way, shading along here, and I'm just going to quickly block in a halftone. And everything that falls under is going to fall into shadow. And then everything that's on this side, so this is interesting, they're doing it this way because we have a hint of shading it softly like a sphere, and also we have a sharp edge like the cube or the pyramid. Just fix one thing right there. So all of this is a sharp edge, so this is all going to fall into shadow. And in this particular case, the darkest dark is going to fall near the lightest light. And we have reflected light. It gets softer as it moves away. But the darkest dark is at this point. All right through here. And then we need to have that soft turn up here. Remember, light has to remain within the form. Light should not be on the edges. We want to avoid rim lighting. Rim lighting in general, by most people's standards, is considered to be unartistic. And then we now are going to have the core shadow, and I'm going to have it darker as it comes closer to us, but as it recedes, the core shadow will get a little softer. And then I want to make sure I do it rounded with the form. And I'm going to put a slight tone over the whole end there. So darkest dark near the lightest light. Then we have the core shadow. We have the reflected light under here, but it needs to be a tiny bit darker because remember, we don't want the reflected light to be the same value as the halftone. And now I'm going to try to darken this area in here a bit of the halftone. And I want the light to be more toward the end here and the rest to kind of disappear. And there we go. And what I'll try to do now is soften this line up here a little bit where I quickly blocked it in, because I want that to be a little bit more subtle. And then I'll go back in and fix this in just a sec. So now, going back in here, we'll just do that soft turn. Here we go, soft turn. And it blends away. Then we need to, right in here, remember the cast shadow. So we're gonna have the cast shadow through here, coming toward us. And on this side where it went under, I want to make sure that we have a small subtle cast shadow. Darkest dark near the edge of the form. And kind of round this out a little bit, just ever so subtly. Darkest dark in here, remember, is right near the form, gets softer as we move away. So now we have, if we were looking at this and we're trying to make sure that all the elements of shading have been met, we now have, you can see we have light, we have halftone, we have core shadow, we have reflected light, we have cast shadow. The only thing that we have not included at this point is the highlight on the cylinder. And let me just do this just a little bit more subtle and make sure that reflected light is not the same value as the halftone. Cast shadow should be, remember, cast shadow has to be as dark as this core shadow in here. So now we have the shading of this is a little interesting because remember the lightest light is by the darkest dark whenever there's a sharp edge. So right in here, lightest light, but it's going to move away, and we need to show that it also is on a cylinder and it is somewhat round. So we're going to have this continue through. And then I want to soften this top section just a little bit more. Soften this just a little bit more for the halftone. And our lightest light is near the darkest dark, right on this lip. And then it gets softer as it moves away, just like the dark shadow gets softer as it moves away. So there we go. Now we have all the elements in here. This reflected light possibly is a little too light still. Now we'll move down to the cone. So we have our cone through here. The light's coming from above. It's a little bit similar to the pyramid, except that we don't have a sharp edge. So we need to have a soft turn, very much like the sphere. So we're going to quickly just, light coming from above, we're going to put a soft tone. And we want it to kind of remember to wrap around the surface. So all of this is going to have a halftone. And the other side, remember, it needs to have that 10% turn, a real soft turn here. We want the light to stay within the form. So now we have halftone and we have light. Now we're going to start to add in here our core shadow. And once we start including the core shadow, it starts to bring out the reflected light. And from this core shadow, we want to have halftone moving toward the light so that it blends very softly and carefully. So I'm going to put a slight tone here now into the reflected light because I don't want it to be the same value as the halftone. And now we'll add a highlight through here. So right in here is the highlight. And it moves and it gets softer. The brightest light's in here. It gets softer as it moves away. And I can make the core shadow, I think, should be darker. So I'm going to go back in and work in it a little bit more. You can adjust this in any way you choose to make it softer or more dramatic. I want to make it a little more powerful, so I'm going to darken this. See if I can carefully work on this reflected light. I want to round the top of the cone a little bit. Try to get the edges softer. So that we're drawn more to the area of light. And then again, cast shadow. So remember, our cast shadow should be the same value as the cast shadow and as the core shadow. So this should be the same value as through here. And it gets softer as it moves away. So darkest where the form touches the surface and gets softer as it moves away. This needs to be a little darker through here. A little darker through here. And subtly getting softer as it moves away. So I can kind of round that a little bit here now. Light going through and soften that edge. Soften this line a tiny bit. And then go back in and blend it a little more. Being very careful how hard I press the pencil. So now we have the cone. And then going back to the cube here, I can see where I didn't quite spend enough time. So let's just very quickly go back in here. Fix that a little bit, darken that a little bit more through here. The tone should be a little darker through here. Remember that top section was darker and it got softer as it moved down with the reflected light. This side was dark, the darkest. It was the opposite of the light. Okay. And if you have more time, you can spend a lot of time going back and really kind of cleaning these up and making them perfect. But generally, you'll notice that each one of these has a highlight, it has light, it has halftone, has core shadow, has reflected light, and then has a cast shadow. So lastly, right up here, just to show how this can apply to something maybe that you might find in nature, we will do one more thing right here. And this section up in here, kind of similar to a sphere. And we're going to do a little shading through here. And then right in here, a little shading so that it has reflected light. So now I'm putting in the core shadow. And we'll see if you can kind of figure out what we're doing here in just a second. And then I'm going to have right up here, core shadow, reflected light, and cast shadow in here. And then right through here is a little bit of tone. And all of this, I want to have a cast shadow underneath. So I'm going to soften this, just like those other geometric shapes, when they're sitting on a surface, they cast a shadow. So will this. Gonna have a little tone here on the side, a little tone here on the other side. And coming through here now, have this shape. And it, hopefully you can start to figure out now that we're shading a nose. And this is the nostril. And here's the little area that comes in outside the nostril. So the tip of the nose is very much like shading a sphere. It's rounded through there. Darkest dark inside the nostril, cast shadow. Darkest dark inside the nostril with a cast shadow. The big ball of the nose is going to cast a shadow. And then right in here we have the philtrum, the little area above the mouth. And the side plane of the nose, side plane of the nose. The nasal bone, it runs through here. Sometimes you can see a little indentation there. Depends on the age of the model that you're drawing. And the wing of the nose here is going to have a tone. We'll go into a lot more detail about the head later on, but this is just an exercise in shading. So I want to just kind of clean up the reflected light in here. And I'll go back over it. And right through there, just so you can see how this eraser can really be helpful. And the top part of the wing of the nose in here is going to have light on it, which we'll work on here in a minute. So the side plane of the nose has a tone. So all those principles that we were talking about in those geometric shapes, you can see how they apply. There's a little bit of cartilage in here in this area. And this will have a little area that's rounded in there. The philtrum has a half tone, and it has an edge right in here, which is very much like the edge of the pyramid, and it would have light next to it. Do a soft shadow underneath the cast shadow, getting softer as it moves away. And if light's coming from this side, everything on this side of the nose is going to fall into shadow. You might see a little bit of light on this side here, depending on the angle of the light. And this little area here at the nose. So I'm going to soften this edge in here a little bit more. We get up to where the eye socket and the orbits of the eyes are. And this plane here on the edge might be a little darker right along this nasal bone. A little darker through here. And maybe a little darker through there. Let me just clean this line here. So now what we have is we have all those variations of these geometric shapes as they might apply to drawing the human nose, or, you know, an image in portraiture. So as we can see here, the principles of shading these basic shapes will apply to shading. Basically, if you can shade these, you can shade any combination or variation of these shapes. You can shade anything. Just a couple other little touch-ups here. And one thing I'd left on purpose is originally I'd lightly drawn in a little hint of this other cone. And I wanted to show how you can kind of let some of what you feel are your mistakes or changes that you made along the way can easily be covered up when it gets to shading. Is here, when you can see the remnants of this, if we add just a hint of a background. So I just turn my pencil on edge, and I can make this look like it's a soft background behind the cone, and it softens, so I soften this right into the edge of the form, and we want to continue that through just a little bit so it doesn't just end on the edge. And that will help to bring the cone a little bit more forward and give a hint of a background behind while softening this edge at the same time. So I left my mistakes, but I can easily make those changes and hide those through the shading process. So again, just as a reminder, in the sphere we have the highlight, we have light, we have halftone, we have core shadow running through here, then we have reflected light so that it goes round, and you need to have the sense that it goes under. Then we have cast shadow. Remember that the darkest point of the core shadow and the darkest part of the shadow where the image touches the surface need to be of the same value. This can't be lighter than this, and this should not be lighter than that. They have to basically be the same value. We have that on each one. Remember on the cube here, lightest light falls next to the darkest dark when we have a sharp turn of the plane. Same here, darkest dark is next to the lightest light. The cylinder was interesting because we have the soft turning form going this way, but we also have the distinct plane where we have the lightest light near the darkest dark. If you can work on this for years and years and kind of master your trade, your shading will get better with more practice and with more understanding. Ultimately, drawing the human figure is one of the greatest challenges in terms of shading. So if you work on that for years, it's a great way to practice all the different subtleties for shading. That sums up. Actually, let me just fix this. I want this just a little bit softer as it moves away, so that more of the emphasis is placed on the nose and a little bit less on the philtrum below, because I don't want that coming forward. So I'm going to soften this just a little bit here and just make this blend out a little bit more, because you want your cast shadows and the facial features to blend into the form around the anatomical features that are next to it. So I want the features of this nose to softly blend into the form of the mouth, the orbicularosaurus. But we'll get into the anatomy of the human as we move forward. So that's it. Elements of shading. If you can shade any combination or variation of these basic shapes, you can shade anything. Just keep practicing.